I had one voicemail saved on my phone. 8 years old. Still there because I couldn't bring myself to delete it. My grandson's voice, 4 years old, tiny and breathless. Grandpa Walt, Daddy says you're coming for Christmas. I'm saving you the big couch. He never got to save me that couch. Christmas came and went without me. So did the next 7 after it. For 8 years, I called. I sent cards on every birthday. I mailed checks for school supplies, holiday gifts, things I imagined a boy growing up might need. I drove 40 minutes to my son's house on a Tuesday afternoon just to stand at the door while my daughter-in-law looked through the peephole and didn't answer. I knew she was there. I could hear the television. I knocked 3 times, said it was me, waited 5 full minutes on that porch, then walked back to my truck and sat in the driveway long enough that the neighbors probably thought something was wrong with me. Maybe something was. Then, 8 years after that saved voicemail, an envelope arrived. White, plain, my name written in my son's handwriting. Daniels. I recognized it immediately, the big looping D, the way he always pressed too hard and left indentations in the paper. I'd taught him to write at our kitchen table in Akron when he was 6 years old. Inside was a birthday invitation, Tyler's 12th. My grandson was turning 12, and they were inviting me. I stood in my kitchen for a long time holding that card. My name is Walter Henley. People call me Walt. I spent 31 years as a mechanic at a Goodyear plant outside Akron, Ohio. I retired at 63 with a bad left knee, a decent pension, and a house I owned free and clear on Elmwood Avenue, the same house where Daniel grew up, where his mother and I raised him, where we planted a red maple in the backyard, the spring she got her cancer diagnosis. The maple outlasted her by 14 years. I still raked its leaves every October alone. My wife, Carol, passed 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She never met Renee. I've thought about that more times than I can count. I've wondered if things would have been different if Carol had been there. If there was someone else in that family equation who might have held things together. Or maybe it wouldn't have mattered. Maybe Renee was the kind of person who removed obstacles regardless of what they were. I met Renee twice before the wedding. Both times, she was polite enough, careful. I'd call it now. Studied. She asked questions and nodded at the answers without really processing them, the way someone does when they're deciding what to do with you rather than learning who you are. Daniel was 32, completely in love, oblivious the way people in love tend to be. I kept my concerns to myself. He was a grown man. It wasn't my place. The wedding was fine. I sat in the front row and cried because Carol wasn't there. Daniel hugged me afterward and whispered that Mom would have loved her. I didn't say anything. The trouble started quietly, the way the worst things do. A missed Thanksgiving because Renee's family had plans. A Christmas cut short because she wasn't feeling well. Phone calls that went to voicemail and came back 3 days later with Daniel sounding distracted, clipped, like he was reading from something. Little by little, the distance grew. And then one February afternoon, Daniel called and told me that Renee felt I had been disrespectful to her at Christmas dinner. I thought back to Christmas dinner. I had asked if she wanted more potatoes. That was the only exchange I could recall. I apologized anyway. It didn't matter. The next Christmas, I wasn't invited. Neither was Easter. And then Tyler was born, and I found out from a neighbor who'd seen the birth announcement in the paper. I drove to the hospital. Renee's mother was in the waiting room when I arrived. She looked at me with something close to pity, which I didn't understand at the time. I understand it now. She knew she'd seen this playbook before, I think, or maybe she'd written parts of it herself. A nurse told me the family had requested limited visitors. I sat in that waiting room for 2 hours. Daniel came out once, saw me, and something crossed his face that I couldn't name guilt, maybe, or resignation. He hugged me briefly and said it wasn't a good time. He said he'd call. He went back through the door. I sat another 30 minutes, then drove home. Tyler was 4 months old the first time I held him. Renee was at a shower for a friend. Daniel brought him over on a Saturday morning, and we sat on the back porch, and I held that baby for 3 hours straight. I told Tyler about Carol, told him his grandmother would have sung to him, told him I had songs I could sing too, though I wasn't much of a singer. Tyler slept through most of it, and I didn't mind. That was the last good visit. After that, Renee was always present, always watching, always finding a reason for it to be brief or to end early. And then the visits stopped altogether. And then Daniel stopped answering. And then 8 years passed. In those 8 years, I sent Tyler birthday cards every year. I wrote a note in each one, nothing heavy, just grandfather things. How the maple in the backyard had grown. How I'd found his old baseball from when he visited as a toddler, still on the shelf in the garage. How I hoped school was going well. I never knew if he received them. I never heard back. I sent Daniel letters too, long ones at first, then shorter, then just cards. He responded twice, both times brief, both times not mentioning anything I'd written, just saying he hoped I was doing okay. Polite, empty, like writing to someone you used to know. So when that birthday invitation arrived, and I stood in my kitchen reading it, I didn't feel what I expected. No flood of relief, no joy, just a slow, careful question settling in my chest. Why now? Tyler was turning 12. Renee had spent 8 years building walls. People don't tear down 8 years of walls for a birthday party. Not without a reason, but I also knew that my grandson was 12 years old and didn't understand any of this. He was a child who had been fed whatever version of me Renee had decided to give him. If there was any chance he wanted to know me, the real me, not the version she'd constructed, I had to go. I wrote the date on my calendar, 2 weeks out. I didn't let myself hope. I let myself prepare. The morning of Tyler's party, I woke at 5 and couldn't sleep again. I made coffee and sat at Carol's kitchen table. I still called it that. Always would, and I looked at the red maple through the window. October, leaves, just starting to turn. Carol had loved October. I talked to her some mornings when the house was quiet enough. I told her I was going to see Tyler today. I told her I didn't know what was waiting for me. I asked her to sit with me anyway. I dressed carefully. Dark slacks, a blue button-down she had liked on me, my good shoes. I drove to a bakery and bought a dozen of the nicest cookies they had, the kind with real buttercream, boxed and tied with a ribbon. Then I drove to the toy store and bought Tyler a model kit, a detailed replica of a 1969 Ford Mustang, the kind you had to build yourself. I'd had one as a boy. I thought maybe he would too. Daniel and Renee lived in a newer subdivision about 20 miles east of Akron. Cookie-cutter houses with vinyl siding and identical mailboxes. But theirs had good landscaping. Renee's doing, probably. Neatly trimmed hedges and a stone path up to the front door. 3 cars in the driveway I didn't recognize. Through the window, I could see people moving around inside. I sat in my truck for a minute. Just 1 minute. Then I got out, took the gifts, and rang the bell. Daniel answered. He looked older than I remembered, tired in the eyes, heavier in the face. He blinked when he saw me, as if he'd half expected I wouldn't come. "Dad," he said. "Hey, son." A beat of something passed between us, all the years of it, compressed into 2 words in a doorway, and then he stepped back and let me in. The house was crowded, maybe 20 adults and several children running through the living room. I recognized no one. Renee was standing near the kitchen doorway in a yellow dress, talking to 2 women. She saw me the moment I walked in. Her expression didn't change, not exactly, but something behind her eyes shifted like a lock being turned. "Walter," she said. She crossed the room. She smiled. "So glad you could make it." She did not hug me. She touched my arm, one brief practice touch, and then stepped back. "Tyler's in the backyard. We'll do presents and cake in about an hour." I nodded. "Thank you for the invitation." She looked at me for just a half-second longer than necessary, then turned back to her friends. Daniel led me to the backyard. Tyler was there with 4 other boys, all of them chasing each other around a bouncy castle in the corner. He was tall for 12, lanky, with Carol's coloring, something I noticed immediately and felt all at once. He had her light eyes, her stubborn chin. "Tyler," Daniel called. "Come here." Tyler jogged over. He was breathing hard from running. He looked at me with open curiosity and zero recognition. "This is Grandpa Walt," Daniel said. "My dad?" Something moved across Tyler's face. Not warmth, not coldness, just the careful consideration of a child absorbing new information. "Oh," he said. Then, with 12-year-old pragmatism, "You got cookies?" I held out the box. "And a model car." He took both, examined the car box, and nodded with a seriousness that made me want to smile. "Cool," he said, and then he ran back to his friends. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was real. I stood in the corner of that backyard for the next 40 minutes. Daniel stayed nearby, but found excuses not to talk, checking the grill, refilling drinks, circling back with a brief comment about the weather before drifting away again. I watched Tyler play. I watched my grandson and tried to memorize the way he moved so I could keep it. Then Renee tapped a fork against her glass. The yard quieted. People gathered around a folding table near the back fence, covered in presents and a sheet cake with blue icing. Renee stood at the head of it with her hand on Daniel's arm, very deliberate in her positioning. "Thank you all so much for being here," she said. She was good at this, warm in public, controlled. "Before we do cake, Daniel and I wanted to share something with our family. Something that affects all of us." I felt it. The same instinct I used to get on the plant floor when a machine was running wrong, a sound slightly off, a vibration that didn't belong. Something is about to go wrong. I'd learned to trust that feeling. "As most of you know," Renee continued, "we've been planning to relocate. Daniel's firm has offered him a partnership in their Charlotte office. It's an incredible opportunity." Polite murmurs, nodding, scattered congratulations. "But relocating means we need to make some decisions about our assets here in Ohio. The house, primarily." She smiled. "We've looked at our options, and the cleanest path forward is a family arrangement. Something that keeps things simple and keeps the value within the family." Daniel cleared his throat. "Dad." He was looking at me now. "We've been thinking. You have the house on Elmwood. You own it outright." I said nothing. "The thing is, Dad, you're 67. That house is bigger than you need. Property taxes alone are eating into your fixed income, and if you ever need assisted living down the road," he stopped, swallowed, recalibrated. "We were thinking, if you put the house in our names now, as a family transfer, we could manage it, sell it if needed. You'd have access to the proceeds, and you'd free yourself from the maintenance, the taxes. It just makes more sense." Renee added smoothly, "And of course you'd be part of Tyler's life now. Real part. We've talked about it, and we want that. We want you there for him." There it was. The same bait, different hook. "Come back to your grandson, but first, sign your house over to us." The house on Elmwood. Carol's kitchen table. The red maple in the backyard. 31 years of mortgage payments. Every single one of them. The house I owned because I had worked 3 decades with my hands and never spent money I didn't have. The house where I planned to live out the rest of my life. Because it was mine and I understood its walls and its creaks, and I could smell Carol in it on certain quiet mornings when the light came through the kitchen window exactly right. They had done their research, just like Anne and Alan in that other life. They knew the Elmwood house was paid off. They knew my pension amount. They knew what I had, and they had built this entire afternoon around asking me to hand it over. Tyler was watching me from across the yard, model car box still in his hands. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him. My son, who I had taught to ride a bike and change a tire and tell the truth even when it was hard. My son, who I had watched Renee hollow out over 12 years until what was left was a man who would stand in his backyard at his child's birthday party and ask his elderly father to sign away his house. "No," I said. The word fell into the quiet like a stone into still water. Renee's smile stayed in place through what I could only call willpower. "Walter." "No," I said again, quieter. "I understand exactly what you're asking. The answer is no." Daniel's face did something complicated. Part of him, I think, had expected this. Maybe even hoped for it. Hoped I would refuse so that whatever came next could be framed as my fault. "Dad, if you just think about it." "I've thought about it." I looked at him steadily. "I've thought about a lot of things for 8 years, Daniel. About every phone call I made that you didn't return. Every birthday card I sent without a response. Every time I stood at your door." My voice didn't rise. "I'd spent 31 years in a loud plant and learned that the quieter you spoke, the more people listened. I came today because I wanted to see Tyler. That's all I wanted. That's all I've ever wanted." Tyler had drifted closer. He was listening now, the model car box pressed against his chest. I picked up my jacket from the chair. "Happy birthday, Tyler," I said. "I meant it. I hope you build that car." I walked through the house and out the front door. Daniel followed me to the driveway. "Dad, wait." His voice had dropped, and the party host quality had gone out of it. Something underneath was raw, like a wound kept bandaged too long. "I know this came out wrong." It came out exactly the way it was designed to come out. I opened my truck door. Renee planned this. Maybe you helped. I don't know how much of it was you anymore, and that's its own kind of grief. He didn't deny it. I'm not angry with you, son, I said. And somehow, that was true. It was sadder than anger. But I'm not signing anything, and I'm not going to keep showing up and waiting to be used. I'm done waiting. I got in the truck. He stood in the driveway as I backed out. He didn't move to stop me. I don't know if that meant he couldn't, or that somewhere underneath everything, he understood. I drove back to Elmwood Avenue and sat in Carol's kitchen for a long time. Then I opened a notebook and started writing. The first call I made the following Monday was to a lawyer named Patricia Simmons, who a friend from the plant had used for his estate work. Her office was on the third floor of a building downtown. Modest, efficient. She had reading glasses and a direct way of speaking that I appreciated immediately. I told her everything. The 8 years, the invitation, the birthday party. She listened without interrupting, made notes, and when I finished, she looked at me over her glasses. You want to protect your assets, she said. I want to make sure they can never try this again. She nodded once. Then we document everything now, while the details are fresh. And we update your estate documents to remove your son as beneficiary until further notice. The conversation that followed was the most purposeful I'd had in years. By the time I left her office 2 hours later, I had a plan. New will, updated deed. A letter on file documenting the coercive attempt at Tyler's party, signed and notarized, in case anyone ever disputed the changes or claimed I'd been mentally impaired when I made them. I also had clarity. I drove home, made coffee, and sat looking at the red maple in the backyard for the better part of an afternoon. It was a good tree. Strong, but I had planted it for Carol, and Carol was gone, and the house had been keeping me in Akron long after Akron had stopped being a reason to stay. I had a cousin in Beaufort, South Carolina. Jimmy, 10 years younger than me, retired Navy, divorced, funny in the way only people who've seen hard things can be. We'd talked on the phone twice a year and exchanged Christmas cards, and that was the entirety of our adult relationship. Once, years ago, he'd told me Beaufort was the most beautiful town in America, and I should come see it before I died. I'd laughed at the time. I called him that evening. Jimmy, I said, tell me about Beaufort. He talked for 40 minutes. Old houses, Spanish moss, the smell of salt water, shrimping boats on the river, people who minded their business and took care of their neighbors. Retired folks, military, artists, fishermen. A town that had been around since before the revolution and had no intention of hurrying. There's a cottage 2 blocks from the water, he said. Been on the market since spring. Owner wants to sell fast. I've walked past it 50 times. Good bones, Walt. Needs work. How much? He told me. I could buy it outright and still have more than enough left over. Let me come see it, I said. I drove down in November. Jimmy met me at the cottage on a Tuesday morning. It was a white clapboard house. Small, single story, with a covered porch and a yard of live oak that filtered the light into something almost liquid. The floors inside were old heart pine. The kitchen was narrow but workable. 1 bedroom, 1 bath, a sun porch that faced east. I walked through it twice, stood on the porch for a while, watched a brown pelican coast past over the treetops. I'll take it, I said. Jimmy bought me a beer and clapped me on the back like I'd done something brave. I didn't feel brave. I felt like a man who had finally stopped standing at doors that wouldn't open. I listed the Elmwood house in January. It sold in 3 weeks to a young couple who walked through it twice and made an offer the same day. I gave them the red maple as part of the deal. I told the woman, who was young and hopeful in the way young people are when they're starting something, that it was a good tree and it liked October. She looked at me like I was slightly odd, which I probably was. I packed what mattered. Carol's kitchen table came with me. Her good dishes, the ones she never used but kept for someday. My tools, all of them, because a man without tools in a house that needs work is helpless. Photographs. The saved voicemail, transferred to a new phone. Tyler's voice, 4 years old, still there. Beaufort in February was cool and salt-aired and quiet. Jimmy helped me unload the truck, and we ate takeout on the porch that first night, watching the dark settle over the oaks. He didn't ask a lot of questions. He'd had his own complications with his kids after the divorce and understood some things without needing them explained. "You'll like it here," he said. "I think I already do." The neighbors on my left were a couple in their 70s, retired teacher and a former army chaplain named George, who brought over cornbread the second day and stayed 2 hours. The neighbors on my right was a woman named Deb, who ran a pottery studio out of her garage and left a mug on my porch with a note that said, "Welcome to the block." It was a good mug. I used it every morning. I started the repairs slowly, the way work should be done when you're doing it right. Replaced 3 sections of porch railing, fixed the back door so it closed properly, repainted the sun porch, rebuilt a rotted section of fence. My knee complained, but my hands remembered everything. 31 years of mechanical work doesn't leave you. I found a rhythm. Mornings on the porch with coffee and the paper. Afternoons working on the house or walking along the river. Tuesdays, I started volunteering at a marine education center where I helped maintain equipment and took school groups through the boat shed. The children were endlessly curious and fearless, the way children are when adults aren't afraid in front of them. Jimmy and I had dinner twice a week. He was better company than I'd expected, or maybe I'd just gotten better at receiving it. We didn't talk about Daniel or Renee. We talked about baseball and bad weather and the best place to eat fried shrimp on the island. We watched games on his television and disagreed about quarterbacks and drank reasonable amounts of beer for men our age. I didn't miss Akron. I was surprised by that at first, and then I wasn't. 4 months after I moved, a certified letter arrived. I recognized the county seal before I opened it. Erie County, the same courthouse where I'd filed my estate updates. My stomach didn't drop, exactly. More like it settled, heavy, and prepared. Daniel, through a lawyer, was contesting the estate changes. The claim was that I had made the changes under duress and without full mental capacity, that I had acted impulsively after a family misunderstanding, and that the removal of Daniel as beneficiary constituted emotional retaliation. There was also a second claim, one that made me sit down with the letter and read it 3 times. The claim stated that at Tyler's birthday party, I had verbally agreed in front of witnesses to consider a property transfer, and that by leaving abruptly, I had breached a verbal agreement that the family had relied upon in making relocation decisions, in front of witnesses, in front of 20 people at a 12-year-old's birthday party who had watched Renee deliver a prepared presentation while Daniel stood at her elbow. I called Patricia Simmons from the sun porch, watching the oaks move in the afternoon wind. "I expected something like this," she said. Her voice was calm. "This is why we documented in November. We have the letter, the notarized statement, the timeline. Your mental acuity at the time of the changes is fully supported by the record. The verbal agreement claim is nothing. You said no, in front of every one of those witnesses. That is not an agreement. Any judge will see that immediately. What do? We respond, and then we go to court if they push it, which I suspect they will, because they're hoping you'll settle to avoid the hassle." We went to court. I flew back to Akron on a gray March morning and sat in Patricia's office the night before the hearing, going over documents spread across her desk. She was methodical and unruffled. The opposition was using a firm out of Cleveland, expensive, which told me something about how certain Renee was of her position, or how much Daniel's money she was willing to spend. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and spare. Daniel and Renee sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 attorneys. Renee wore a gray suit and had her hands folded in front of her. She did not look at me. Daniel did, once, briefly, and then away. The judge was a woman named Judge Claire Whitmore, 50s, with close-cropped hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain. She had reviewed the filings before the hearing, which I could tell because her questions were pointed and arrived without preamble. Renee's attorney presented their case first. He was smooth and practiced, the kind of lawyer who understood that a sympathetic story was worth more than precedent in front of a jury, though there was no jury here. He talked about a troubled family relationship, a father who had become erratic and difficult, a son who had spent years trying to maintain connection. He talked about the birthday party as a good-faith attempt at reconciliation that Walt had responded to by leaving abruptly and immediately taking legal action against his own son. Then he said that my estate changes, made within 2 weeks of the party, demonstrated an impulsive, retaliatory state of mind, inconsistent with someone of sound judgment. Patricia presented our response. She was briefer and quieter, and laid the documents out one at a time like bricks. 8 years of phone records, my outgoing calls to Daniel, logged and dated. 0 return calls over the final 5 of those years. A stack of card and letter receipts, birthday and holiday, with the year and recipient documented. Photographs of the gifts I'd sent, some purchased at stores with receipt records attached. The notarized statement I'd written in November, documenting the birthday party event in full detail within 2 weeks of it happening, before any lawsuit was filed. And then Patricia produced the deed history and the timeline of my estate updates, demonstrating clearly that I had consulted a lawyer, made deliberate and documented decisions, and had done so with full competency and complete prior cause. She put the last document on the judge's desk. Mr. Henley did not act impulsively after a misunderstanding, she said. He acted with precision after 8 years of patience that was met with silence, and a birthday party that was designed to obtain his property. The judge studied everything for several minutes. The room was quiet. Outside, through a high window, I could see a pale March sky. Then Judge Whitmore looked up. "I'm going to say what I see here," she said. Her voice was measured. "A man spent 8 years attempting contact with his son and grandson. His attempts are documented. The other side's attempts are not, because they did not occur. He was invited to a family event for the first time in 8 years. At that event, he was asked to sign over his home to parties who had refused to speak to him for nearly a decade." She looked at Renee's attorney. "The oral agreement claim is dismissed. A man saying he'll think about it is not an agreement. Saying no in front of 20 people is not a breach." She removed her glasses. "As for the estate changes, a man has the full legal right to determine who benefits from his own property. He requires no one's permission and no one's approval. The mental capacity argument is not supported by a single piece of evidence." The gavel came down. Daniel left the courtroom without speaking to me. Renee walked out ahead of him, her jaw set, her eyes forward. In the hallway, I stood with Patricia for a moment, while she gathered her papers. "You did very well in there," she said. I mostly sat still. She smiled. "Sometimes that's the whole job." I flew back to Beaufort that evening. Connected through Charlotte, delayed 40 minutes. So I sat in the gate area and drank bad airport coffee and watched people move through their lives in that purposeful airport way, everyone with somewhere to be. I felt a long way from the man who had stood at his son's door 8 years ago and waited to be let in. When I landed in Beaufort, Jimmy picked me up. He looked at my face when I got in the car and said, "Good?" "Good," I said. He stopped for fried shrimp on the way home. We ate in the parking lot because neither of us wanted to wait. The months that followed were the quietest I'd known in a long time. Quiet in the way good things are, quiet full, not empty. I finished the porch, started a small garden on the south side of the house. George from next door taught me to cast net for shrimp off the dock downtown. Jimmy taught me to play chess badly, then slightly less badly. The Marine Center asked if I'd come 3 days a week instead of 2. I said yes. I was fixing the last section of fence in September when the email arrived. I saw it when I came inside for water. The address was Tyler's name, which meant Renee had set up an account for him, which was normal for a 12-year-old. I opened it on my phone, standing in the kitchen with a glass of water in my hands still dirty from the work. "Grandpa Walt, Mom doesn't know I'm writing this. I found your email from the old birthday card. I wanted to say I built the model car, and it's on my desk. It took 4 days because I kept messing up the hood. I wanted to say I'm sorry for not knowing you. I know stuff happened. I don't really understand all of it, but I heard you left the party and then there was a court thing. Dad doesn't talk about it. I just wanted to say the car is really cool and I think it's not fair you couldn't come to stuff. If you want to write back, you can. If you don't, that's okay too. Tyler." I read it twice. Set the phone on the counter and stood there. Then I sat down at Carol's kitchen table and I cried. Not the way I'd cried when Carol died, not that bottomless kind. This was something different. This was relief. This was a 12-year-old boy who had figured out, on his own, that something wasn't right, who had gone looking and found me. I wrote back the next morning, when I had thought about what I wanted to say. I told him about Beaufort, about the shrimp boats and the live oaks. I told him about the model car I'd had as a boy, the same one, a 1969 Mustang in dark green that I'd kept on my dresser until I was 17. I told him his grandmother Carol would have liked the sound of him. I told him that what had happened between the adults in our family was complicated and it wasn't his to carry. I told him the door on my end was always open. We emailed back and forth through the fall, carefully. Nothing too heavy. He told me about school, about his soccer team, about a book he'd read. I told him about the garden and the shrimp net and the pelicans. Neither of us mentioned Daniel or Renee. It wasn't avoidance, exactly. It was two people building something new without digging up old ground. Jimmy came over on a Saturday in November and found me on the porch reading, coffee going cold in the mug Deb had given me. "You look different," he said. "Different how?" He settled into the chair across from me and considered it. Settled, like you stopped waiting for something. I thought about that. The 8 years of waiting. The birthday parties I wasn't invited to. The voicemail I'd kept for 8 years because it was the last evidence I had that I'd once been someone's grandpa. I thought about the courthouse in Akron and the judge's steady voice. About Tyler's email, plain and direct, the way boys his age write before they learn to hide things. "I think I stopped waiting about a year ago," I said. Jimmy nodded. He understood the geography of that. We sat for a while listening to the oaks. The river was a few blocks away. You could smell it on certain days, salt and tide, and something older than either of us. George waved from his yard. Down the block, Deb's wheel was going in the garage. Ordinary afternoon in a life I had built from what was left after everything else was taken. Not taken. That's not accurate. I'd given too much, stayed too long, knocked on too many closed doors. The difference between having something taken and giving it away until there was nothing left, that distinction had taken me years to understand. I hadn't been robbed. I'd been so afraid of losing my son that I'd made myself available to whatever version of me he and Renee decided I could be. That wasn't love. That was fear with a familiar name. Carol would have called it sooner. She had a directness I'd admired and never fully learned. I was learning it now, late, but learning. "I got a letter from Daniel," I said. Jimmy looked at me. 2 weeks ago. I haven't answered it yet. I'd read it 4 times and left it on the kitchen table. It was short, not eloquent. He said he knew the court thing hadn't gone the way they'd hoped. He said he'd been thinking. He said he wasn't sure what he wanted to say, but that he was sorry for the years of distance and that Renee and he were working through some things. He did not mention the birthday party or the house. He said he hoped I was well. It was the most honest communication I'd had from my son in more than a decade. I didn't know what to do with it. "What are you going to do?" Jimmy asked. "I don't know yet." I looked out at the oaks. I know I'm not going back to what it was. 8 years of sending things into silence and waiting for a door to open. That's done. But he's my son. I said it the way you say things that are complicated and simple at the same time. That doesn't go away. I stopped expecting things from him. That's not the same as not caring what happens to him. Jimmy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You'll figure out what's right." Eventually, I looked at my coffee, cold now. I'd answer Daniel's letter. Not immediately, not with warmth I didn't have yet, but I'd answer it. I would say that I was well, that Beaufort was good, that I hoped he was working towards something real. I would not reopen the question of us, but I would leave the door slightly ajar, because he was my son, and because closed doors were Renee's tactic, and I didn't want it to be mine. Tyler's door was already open. We both knew it. I thought about what I would tell anyone listening to this story, anyone who recognized themselves in it. I thought about every year I'd spent making myself smaller, calling more gently, sending more carefully, trying to be whatever version of me would finally be acceptable enough to be let in. Here is what I know now. You cannot negotiate your way into someone's love by making yourself easier to dismiss. You cannot earn your place in a family that has decided to use you by being more useful. The moment you realize that the people who should love you are treating you like a transaction, that is the moment to stop. It doesn't mean you stop loving them. It means you stop paying for what should be free. I was 67 years old and I had a cottage 2 blocks from the water and a grandson who emailed me about model cars and a neighbor who made good cornbread and a cousin who knew when to be quiet. I had Carol's kitchen table and her dishes for someday, and a garden that would come back in the spring. I had my dignity. That was the one thing they couldn't ask me to sign away, and the one thing I should have protected from the beginning. The sun was dropping behind the oaks, throwing long shadows across the yard. The air had that evening quality it gets in fall, cooler and softer all at once. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something worth barking at. Jimmy stood up, stretched, said he'd better get home. He squeezed my shoulder on the way past. No words needed. I sat on the porch until the light was almost gone. Then I went inside, turned on the kitchen lamp, and started a letter to my son. One word at a time. No promises. No doors flung wide. Just a man who had learned slowly, expensively, irreversibly, that the ones worth holding on to were the ones you didn't have to beg. I wrote 3 paragraphs. Read them back. They were honest and they were careful, and they were mine. I sealed the envelope and set it by the door for morning. Then I made fresh coffee and brought it out to the porch, and I sat in the dark listening to Beaufort be exactly what it was, steady, salt-aired, and unhurried, and I felt something I had spent the better part of a decade trying to find. I felt like I was home.